chemical sunscreen to the measles outbreak and drug approvals to product recalls, dermatology experienced its share of firsts and controversies in 2019. For the first resident takeover of 2020, my fellow Cutis resident corner columnist and I are going to be talking about some of the issues in dermatology that made the news in 2019 and how those issues have affected patient care.
That's Dr. Daniel Mazori, and this is Dermatology Weekly, the weekly podcast from MD Edge Dermatology. I'm MD Edge editor Elisabeth Tracey.
And I'm MD Edge editor Terry Rudd. Today in our resident takeover, Dr. Daniel Mazori, Dr. Elisabeth Tracey, and Dr. Judy Croley recap some of the dermatology issues and controversies that made headlines in 2019. And they discuss how they've addressed those issues with their patients.
In the news this week, abnormalities in lipids, liver enzymes, and complete blood counts were rare among patients taking isotretinoin for acne. And serious abnormalities were virtually non-existent. Plus, European health authorities suspend marketing of ingenol mebutate for actinic keratosis.
You can reach Dermatology Weekly by emailing us at podcasts@mdedge.com. You can find that email address in the show notes.
And now the news.
We begin today with a recommendation from the European Medicines Agency. Patients should stop using ingenol mebutate while the agency continues to review its safety profile. Ingenol mebutate is marketed as Picato. It's a topical treatment approved in Europe and the United States to treat actinic keratosis. The EMA's Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee is reviewing data on skin cancer in patients treated with the drug. The data include a trial comparing Picato and imiquimod. That trial showed that skin cancer was more common in the areas treated with Picato, compared with areas treated with imiquimod at 3.3% versus 0.4%. The EMA says that despite uncertainties, there's concern about a possible link between the use of Picato and the development of skin cancer. Despite the recommendations in Europe, U.S. health authorities haven't issued warnings about ingenol mebutate. The FDA says it's reviewing the situation. Leo Pharma markets Picato. The company announced in early January that it was initiating a voluntary withdrawal of marketing authorization, and it's contemplating a possible voluntary withdrawal of Picato in the European Union. But a Leo Pharma spokesperson says the European actions don't affect Picato in the U.S. The company says there are no new developments in the U.S. and that it's committed to ensuring patient safety, rigorous monitoring, and transparency. Picato has been approved for use in the EU and the U.S. since 2012.
Abnormalities in lipids, liver enzymes, and blood counts were rare among patients taking isotretinoin for moderate to severe acne who received lab testing, and serious abnormalities were virtually non-existent. That's according to the results of new research published in the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology. In a retrospective study of more than 1,800 patients who received isotretinoin, dermatologist Dr. John Barbieri of the University of Pennsylvania and co-authors report that there were no cases of grade 4 abnormalities of lipids, liver enzymes, or complete blood counts. They also report that fewer than 1% of patients had grade 2 to 3 lab abnormalities, and no patients had cholesterol or CBC abnormalities of grade 3 or higher. The authors say the results affirm that most patients fare well on isotretinoin, and frequent lab testing is likely to be low yield. Indeed, they calculate that the monitoring regimen puts the cost of detecting one single grade 3 hepatic enzyme elevation at around $6,000, and the cost of detecting one grade 3 triglyceride elevation is nearly $8,000. We'll be right back after this message.
Before we get into this week's resident conversation, we'd like to make a special announcement. The very first issue of Skin and Allergy News, now known as Dermatology News, was published all the way back in January 1970. That means that As of this month, we are 50 years old. In that flagship edition, our very first front-page story heralded the increasingly widespread use of steroids as dermatology's most important development of the 1960s. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us on any part of our journey, whether through this podcast, the MD Edge Dermatology website, or, of course, our print publication. Throughout this year, we'll be publishing articles and features to mark our golden anniversary. You can read the very first edition of Skin and Allergy News by clicking the link in the podcast notes. And now, Dr. Daniel Mazori, Dr. Elisabeth Tracey, and Dr. Judy Croley.
From chemical sunscreen to the measles outbreak and drug approvals to product recalls, dermatology experienced its share of firsts and controversies in 2019. My name is Dan Mazori, and I'm a dermatology resident at SUNY Downstate in Brooklyn. For the first resident takeover of 2020, my fellow Cutis resident corner columnist and I are going to be talking about some of the issues in dermatology that made the news in 2019 and how those issues have affected patient care. First, I'll have my colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Libby Tracey, and I'm a dermatology resident at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio.
And I'm Julie Croley, a dermatology resident at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas.
Thanks for joining me, Libby and Julie. Let's start with chemical sunscreen. Chemical sunscreen made headlines in 2019 for two reasons: concerns over coral reef toxicity and systemic absorption in humans. What was the issue with coral reef toxicity?
The effects of chemical sunscreen on coral reefs are controversial. These concerns have driven the passage of laws in Key West, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which restrict the sale of chemical sunscreen with organic UV filters, such as oxybenzone. By passing these bans, these areas have joined Hawaii and parts of Mexico in restricting chemical sunscreen sales.
It's definitely controversial. The opponents of the Key West ban, including dermatologists who believe it will discourage sunscreen use, are currently trying to overturn the ban before it goes into effect in January 2021.
And in addition to the political sector, the business sector has started to follow suit with their own chemical sunscreen restrictions. In August 2019, CVS announced that it would remove 2 organic UV filters, oxybenzone and octinoxate, from some of its store brand chemical sunscreens by the end of 2020. How have you guys addressed this issue with your patients?
I have not had any patients specifically inquire about this issue yet, but suspect that this is to come with the recent proposal for regulation changes. If it does come up, I think it may be important to note that, as summarized by a 2019 article in the JAD by Schneider and Lim, coral reef endangerment appears to be multifactorial, with the most important factor arguably being warming ocean temperatures. As of now, the levels of organic UV filters in the environment are in the low to zero toxicity ranges for coral reef. So I think it's important to tell patients sort of the facts, what's known. But, yeah, I haven't had any patients come to me with that issue yet.
You know, Julie, I haven't had any patients ask about this either yet. And I typically recommend sunscreens that contain zinc oxide for multiple reasons, but it's definitely not my practice to bring up coral reef as one of those reasons. I haven't had to address it yet, but I think that would be a really good strategy.
I've had a similar experience with you guys, and I wonder if that's because we're in residency in states that aren't yet affected by such laws. I wonder if this is the trend to come, then potentially in the future, wherever we end up practicing in the long run may be affected by laws such as this. But at the very least, if any of our patients go on vacation in any of these parts of the world, then these are some of the bans that they're going to have to follow. So definitely something to keep an eye on, see what happens. The other chemical sunscreen controversy this past year stemmed from systemic absorption in humans. What was the issue here?
So in February 2019, The U.S. FDA proposed that there's insufficient data to determine if 12 organic UV filters, such as oxybenzone, if they're generally recognized as safe and effective. And although the FDA did list them as safe and effective in 2011, the rise in sunscreen use since then, as well as changes in the sunscreen formulations, prompted the FDA to ask manufacturers to perform additional studies on safety parameters, such as systemic absorption.
So this announcement was followed by a study conducted by the FDA showing that maximal use of 4 sunscreens resulted in systemic absorption. These sunscreens tested were specifically organic sunscreen, such as oxybenzone, and they found that systemic absorption reached above 0.5 nanograms per milliliter, which is the FDA's threshold for requiring non-clinical toxicology assessment.
This is an issue that a lot of my friends asked me about this past year, and some in the industry have suggested that it may take at least 5 years to generate all the data that the FDA has requested. Until then, how have you guys addressed this issue with your patients or anyone else that's asked you about it?
Well, I think it's challenging because the clinical significance of the FDA study is not yet known, as the study itself admits. And the FDA is not currently discouraging sunscreen use and is not saying that these 12 organic UV filters that were studied are unsafe. So for now, both physical sunscreens and chemical sunscreens with those organic filters are considered acceptable by the FDA.
Yeah, so I think for now where we are is in somewhat of a limbo where the FDA has told us that they're not discouraging sunscreen use and that these filters are not unsafe, but that they still don't have enough data to say that they are safe. So it's a little bit of a gray zone. And I think that one way of counseling patients, echoing something that you said earlier, Libby, is that for those who prefer to use only ingredients that are currently listed as generally recognized as safe and effective by the FDA, they should stick with physical sunscreen, which includes ingredients like titanium dioxide or zinc oxide.
Yeah, I agree with you there. For any patient with concerns over the safety of their sunscreen, I just recommend physical sunscreens for the time being until more data comes out. I often recommend the newer microionized physical sunscreens because they don't tend to leave a noticeable white residue, which I think encourages increased use. And they also have light or tinted physical sunscreens for patients with darker skin tones that are more likely to blend.
The next issue to discuss is the measles outbreak in New York City that ended in 2019. Fueled by under-vaccinated communities, this was the largest measles outbreak in New York City in nearly 30 years. Since we as dermatologists are in a position to be stewards of vaccination, how do you counsel your patients about vaccines?
I think it is our duty to counsel vaccine-hesitant patients when they come into our clinic. I think it's important to emphasize that there is no scientific controversy about the safety and effectiveness of childhood vaccines, despite unsubstantiated anti-vaxxer claims that you can easily find on the internet. I don't think it probably comes up in our clinic as much as a primary care provider's office, but it is relevant to many dermatologic conditions, and so I think it is our duty when approached with this issue to be advocates for what we know has scientific data to back it up.
I agree. I do think it is our duty to recommend and support the use of vaccines. And for me in my practice, I typically recommend vaccines for clinically indicated reasons, such as the pneumococcal vaccine for patients that we start on immunosuppression, things like that. I have not seen measles. I think, it's increasingly more common to a very alarming degree, but it's still pretty rare. I haven't seen it yet, so I haven't had to address that particular issue with my patients.
Yeah, even though I'm a resident in Brooklyn, which was the epicenter for the measles outbreak, I never saw a case of measles when it happened, and Neither did any of my co-residents, as far as I know. But we certainly felt the effects of it on the news, and I have some of my co-residents participate in different public health efforts that New York City was putting together in order to fight the outbreak, which altogether cost about $6 million. And Libby, like what you were saying, most of the conversations I have with my patients about vaccinations center around those who are on immunosuppressive medications. For the most part, I haven't had any vaccine-hesitant patients. Most are very interested in getting vaccines when we recommend them. And I've had very few conversations where I've had to, for example, demystify the myth, I think the most common myth about vaccines, that they cause autism. But with the exception of that conversation, which I've had very rarely, most of my patients are on board with them. So it hasn't been something that I've struggled too much with.
I do wonder, though, if we're routinely recommending vaccines and haven't had to have the conversation, that brings up the question of whether or not patients are comfortable bringing up their concerns with us when we take it for granted that that's a good recommendation.
That's a good point. How many of our patients are hearing what we're saying and then after the fact choosing not to get the vaccinations or talking with their PCPs afterwards and deciding otherwise?
That's very interesting. I think one of the things that we try to do in our clinics is administer the vaccines then and there. So for the most part, I see most of them getting their vaccines that we've talked about because our nurses administer them right then and there. So I think if clinics can be kind of built around that model, then you're more likely to ensure adherence and get the job done.
That's a good point. At our institution, typically rely on our referrals to get that vaccination completed or administered, but I think probably administering at the time of recommendation would improve compliance.
Beyond sunscreen and measles, the FDA approved several therapies for pediatric dermatology and rare dermatologic conditions in 2019. What were these therapies and why are they noteworthy?
So my absolute favorite biologic, dupilumab, was approved for adolescent atopic dermatitis, making it the third biologic with a pediatric dermatology indication. And that has been, a game changer for pediatric atopic dermatitis for, the really severe kids that just can't get control.
And speaking of pediatric approvals, trifarotene cream and minocycline foam were approved for acne in patients 9 years and older. This is considered a milestone in acne treatment, considering the fact that children have historically been excluded from clinical trials. Also noteworthy is the fact that trifarotene cream is the only topical retinoid to selectively target the retinoic acid receptor gamma, and to have been studied specifically for both facial and truncal acne. And in addition to this, minocycline foam is the first topical tetracycline. So it's an exciting time as well in topical acne medication advancements.
My two favorite approvals of 2019 involved rare dermatologic conditions. So apremilast became the first FDA-approved medication for oral ulcers due to Behçet's disease this past year. And I just thought that was really interesting and something that I hope, even though it's a rare condition, will be able to help those patients who have Behçet's and who otherwise didn't have an FDA-approved medication before. And the other one was a medication called afamelanotide, and this was the first FDA-approved medication for erythropoietic protoporphyria, also approved this past year, and is believed to confer photoprotection in those patients by increasing the production of eumelanin in the epidermis. Have any of these drug approvals so far changed the way that you've been treating your patients?
I would probably have to mirror Libby's excitement with dupilumab. I think the most significant approval in my practice has been the dupilumab approval for adolescent atopic dermatitis. Prior to its approval, I had a couple of patients in the 12 to 17-year-old age group with severe atopic dermatitis who previously failed treatment with topical agents. And this approval provided another treatment option for them, and in a couple of cases really improved the patient's condition.
I agree. Dupilumab is definitely the most exciting one this year for me. I'm currently on my pediatric rotation, and it's so exciting to have that more solidly in our toolbox now. As we all know, getting things approved by insurance is half the battle, and having the FDA approval really is so great for our patients and the likelihood that we'll be able to get them on this extremely effective therapy.
That's really awesome to hear. For whatever reason, I haven't seen too many teenagers with atopic dermatitis. So as exciting as the approval is, I'm still holding out on the approval for younger children. In our clinics, it's those kids who we tend to see with very refractory atopic dermatitis and still don't have dupilumab, FDA approved for. So that's the age group that I'm looking forward to the most. But it's awesome to hear that in your programs you guys are finding utility for dupilumab in teenagers. Are there any drug approvals that you guys are looking forward to this coming year?
So bimekizumab, an IL-17 inhibitor, is anticipated to receive FDA approval for psoriasis in 2020. There have been some clinical studies that have shown that 93 to 100% of patients maintain PASI 90 scores from week 12 to week 60. So I think this is just another exciting biologic that is projected to be available to us in 2020.
Last but not least, there were two popular over-the-counter skincare products that were involved in recalls in 2019. What were these products and why were they recalled?
One lot of Johnson's baby powder was also recalled after the FDA found subtrace levels of asbestos in one of the lot's bottles. Johnson & Johnson reported that 2 third-party laboratories did not ultimately find asbestos, however, when they retested the bottle of interest, as well as other bottles from the recalled lot.
So the Neutrogena Light Therapy Acne Mask, I know I tried this on at a recent American Academy of Dermatology meeting. This is recalled due to rare reports of visual side effects that were transient, but were due to insufficient eye protection from the mask diodes, the light-emitting diodes, and these side effects were associated with only 0.02% of the masks sold at the time of recall. They also cited a risk for potentially irreversible eye injury in people that take photosensitizing medications and people with certain underlying eye conditions. So the Neutrogena Light Therapy Acne Mask was the big recall in the past year.
Did you guys have any patients who were using the mask at that time? Is that something that you had to deal with in your clinics?
The Neutrogena Light Therapy Acne Mask is not something I had a lot of patients using, so it wasn't something that I personally had to address in my clinic. But I think it is our duty that if we recommend something and there's a recall, to inform our patients and let them know.
That does bring up an interesting question. If this was a product that you knew of patients who had been using, what would be our duty, especially if we don't remember exactly which patients were using it?
I also didn't have any personal experience with the Neutrogena Light Therapy Acne Mask or Johnson's baby powder when it came to patient care, but to your point, Libby, about our duty, if we are recommending over-the-counter products to patients that then get recalled and what we should do about it, especially if we can't remember each patient that we've recommended that product to. I think that's really interesting and a situation that's worth thinking about. especially with over-the-counter products that otherwise aren't connected with a tracking number or something like that, where you can exactly find the patient who has it. I think maybe, that's a situation where our electronic medical records can come in handy if you can do a query for a product that you've recommended and documented in the patient's chart. Pull up all the patients that have that in their chart, and then, communicate to them, either with a phone call or some kind of message letting them know about the recall. As far as I know, there aren't any laws or guidelines for what dermatologists or doctors in general are supposed to do in situations like this. But I think, it's inherent in making recommendations to patients that you, I think, would go above and beyond and do your best to let them know about products that you did recommend that are then considered unsafe or being recalled for whatever reason.
And I think that brings up an even bigger issue of what if one of the medications that we prescribe has a new risk or a new adverse effect that's discovered? Is that something that we need to retroactively communicate to our patients?
Yeah, I think the same general principle applies. But with prescription medications, I think it's a little bit easier to get in touch with those patients because there is a paper trail connecting the prescription to the pharmacy, to the drug company, to the patient, whereas if someone were to buy an over-the-counter product with cash or even with credit card, it's harder to track that person down if that product had a recall. But with prescription medications, because of that paper trail, I think it would be a little bit easier to get a hold of the people involved. That brings us to the end of our conversation about some of the issues in dermatology that made headlines in 2019. On behalf of my fellow Cutis Resident Corner columnists, I'm Dan Mazori. Thanks for joining us for Resident Takeover.
And that concludes this week's episode of Dermatology Weekly. To get past and future episodes of Dermatology Weekly, subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Terry Rudd.
For Dr. Vincent DeLeo, MD Edge editor, Melissa Sears, and all of us here at MD Edge, I'm Elisabeth Mishkati. Thanks for listening.